In the fall of 2004, an undercover police officer stood quietly in line at a fast food restaurant in Texas. He blended effortlessly into the crowd, his casual demeanor masking the vigilance of his trained eye. To anyone observing him, he appeared to be just another customer, waiting patiently to place his order. But his focus was not on the menu or the growing line behind him. Instead, his attention was fixed on two people seated near the window, eating their meals. The officer had been shadowing these individuals for most of the day, meticulously documenting their movements and interactions. They had not drawn suspicion from anyone else in the bustling restaurant, their behavior appearing entirely ordinary. Yet something about them now seemed off. The officer glanced in their direction, his gaze lingering for just a moment too long. His instincts, honed over years of experience, signaled that there was more to this pair than met the eye. He shifted his weight, subtly adjusting his position to gain a clearer view of the man seated across from the woman. The man seemed familiar, but it was difficult to place him. The officer's mind worked quickly, cataloging details: the man's dark hair, the way he carried himself, his apparent ease despite the watchful eyes that followed him. Something tugged at the edges of the officer's memory, a faint recognition that he couldn't yet articulate. As the officer continued to observe, he noted the woman's occasional glances over her shoulder. Her movements were calculated, as if she was scanning the room for anything out of place. Her vigilance only deepened the officer's suspicions. People who had nothing to hide rarely behaved this way, especially in a public setting. Her subtle actions spoke of a tension that contrasted sharply with the casual atmosphere of the restaurant. Despite his outward calm, the officer's pulse quickened. He reached down, resting his hand near the concealed firearm beneath his shirt. His instincts warned him to be ready, even though there was no immediate threat. Years in law enforcement had taught him that the most dangerous situations often began with subtle, seemingly innocuous details. He discreetly tapped his partner, who was also undercover and positioned nearby. The signal was clear. Something was happening, and they needed to act. His partner nodded slightly, acknowledging the unspoken command. Together, they began moving toward the pair, their steps deliberate but unhurried. They were no longer simply observers. Their roles as undercover officers had shifted, and now they were poised to intervene. The officer could feel the weight of his decision pressing on him. Every choice he made in these moments could have significant consequences. If he was wrong, if his suspicions were unfounded, it could jeopardize the investigation they had been conducting for weeks. But if he was right, if his instincts were accurate, the stakes could be far higher than he had initially imagined. The restaurant buzzed with the background noise of conversations, clinking utensils, and the hum of a soda machine. To the officer, these sounds faded into insignificance. His entire focus was on the two individuals by the window, their seemingly normal demeanor masking the possibility of something far more sinister. Every detail mattered: the way the man occasionally glanced at the woman, the way she shifted in her seat, the rhythm of their movements. It was a puzzle he was determined to solve, and the pieces were slowly falling into place. As he closed the distance between them, he felt a surge of certainty. He couldn't yet explain why, but he knew there was more to this situation than met the eye. The man's face, partially obscured by the shadows of the restaurant's interior, seemed to flicker with recognition in the officer's mind. A memory surfaced, faint but insistent, tying this moment to something he had encountered before. The officer's hand tightened near his concealed weapon as they approached. His partner mirrored his movements, both men ready for whatever might come next. There was no room for error. The air between them and the table seemed to thicken, the weight of their unspoken suspicions charging the space with an almost palpable tension. When they finally reached the table, the officer's gaze locked onto the man. He didn't need to say a word. His presence, his unwavering stare, was enough to command attention. The man looked up, his expression shifting from casual indifference to something sharper, more alert. The woman, too, reacted, her posture stiffening as her eyes darted between the two officers. The moment stretched, the silence between them filled with unspoken questions and unacknowledged truths. The officer's instincts screamed at him that this was no ordinary encounter. Something about this man, about the way he held himself, about the faint recognition that had been clawing at the edges of the officer's mind, told him that they were on the brink of uncovering something significant. What had started as a routine surveillance operation was now spiraling into uncharted territory. The officer braced himself, knowing that whatever came next would demand all of his training, focus, and resolve. Molly Daniels returned home that evening, her shoulders heavy with the weight of the day. Her job at the home remodeling business was mundane and underpaid, yet it was a lifeline for her family. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the driveway as she pulled into her small suburban home in Leander, Texas. For a moment, she lingered in the car, staring blankly out the window, her mind adrift. It had been a long week, and she felt the exhaustion deep in her bones. Eventually, she gathered her things and stepped out, letting the familiar sounds of the neighborhood pull her back into reality. She approached the front door, mentally bracing herself for the chaos of family life awaiting her on the other side. The house was small but functional, a modest sanctuary for Molly, her husband Clay, and their 2 children. As she stepped inside, the warmth of home wrapped around her like a comforting blanket, momentarily lifting the stress from her shoulders. Inside, the sound of laughter echoed through the rooms. Molly paused, the corners of her mouth lifting into a smile as she recognized the joyful squeals of her 4-year-old son, Caleb. She followed the sound to the living room, where she found Caleb rolling on the floor, his tiny hands playfully swatting at Clay. Her husband, sprawled beneath their son, was grinning as he pretended to be defeated in their wrestling match. Nearby, their 1-year-old daughter sat on the rug, clapping her small hands and giggling at the scene. Molly stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in. The sight of her family's happiness was a balm for her frayed nerves. Clay glanced up at her, his expression a mixture of mischief and love, before returning to his playful battle with Caleb. It was moments like these that reminded Molly why she worked so hard. Despite the challenges they faced, her family was her anchor, the reason she pushed forward each day. She turned toward the kitchen, the comforting hum of family life following her. Dinner preparation was a routine she had grown accustomed to, a small act of care that tied their lives together. As she moved about the kitchen, her thoughts drifted to their circumstances. Life had been far from easy for the Daniels family. Financial strains weighed heavily on them, with Clay out of work for months. He had once been a skilled mechanic, but job opportunities in the area were scarce, and the bills continued to pile up. Molly's job as a receptionist was steady but paid little, barely enough to cover their most basic needs. Each month was a juggling act, deciding which expenses could be postponed and which could not. Yet, in the face of these struggles, they had managed to find moments of joy. Clay's presence at home, though born out of necessity, had brought a special bond between him and the children, particularly Caleb. Caleb was not Clay's biological son, a fact that had once worried Molly deeply. She had feared that Clay might struggle to accept a child from her previous relationship, but those fears had proven unfounded. Clay had embraced Caleb wholeheartedly, treating him as his own from the start. The connection between them was undeniable, their relationship built on love rather than blood. Dinner that evening was a simple affair, the kind of meal born from a tight budget and quick preparation. The family gathered around their small dining table, sharing laughs and stories as they ate. The children's laughter filled the space, their innocence a stark contrast to the burdens carried by their parents. Afterward, the nightly routine unfolded seamlessly. Molly and Clay worked together to put the children to bed, their movements synchronized from years of practice. Once the house was quiet, the couple settled on the couch, the soft glow of the television casting flickering light across the room. It was a rare moment of peace, a time for them to decompress together. But as the night wore on, Molly felt her fatigue catching up to her. She bid Clay good night, leaving him to his late-night television while she made her way upstairs. As she lay in bed, the comforting sounds of the house settling around her, Molly allowed herself a rare moment of contentment. Despite their challenges, despite the constant worry about money and the future, she had a family that loved her. The bond she shared with Clay and her children was a source of strength, a reminder that they could weather whatever storms came their way. Downstairs, Clay remained on the couch, his thoughts his own. It was a quiet night, the kind that often lulled Molly into a peaceful sleep. She drifted off, unaware of the events that would soon unravel the fragile balance of her world. That night, as the house fell silent, Molly lay in bed, her mind drifting between the edges of wakefulness and sleep. The faint sounds of the television hummed from downstairs, a comforting reminder of Clay's presence. At some point, she heard the creak of the front door, followed by the sound of their car engine roaring to life. The noise barely registered, a fleeting moment before she succumbed to exhaustion. Earlier that evening, Clay had mentioned he might visit his mother to drop off a few books, so the sound of him leaving didn't stir her from her rest. Morning came quietly, the sunlight filtering through the curtains as Molly woke to an empty space beside her. She stretched, expecting to find Clay downstairs, perhaps already tending to the children or making coffee. Instead, the house was eerily quiet. As she descended the stairs, a faint unease began to creep into her thoughts. The car wasn't in the driveway, and a search of the house confirmed that Clay was nowhere to be found. Her concern deepened as she picked up the phone and called Clay's mother, hoping for an answer that would dispel her growing fears. The response she received only heightened her alarm. Clay had not arrived at his mother's house the night before. In fact, she hadn't even been expecting him. A cold weight settled in Molly's chest as she realized something was wrong. The drive from their home to Clay's mother's house was a long stretch of winding highway, bordered by dense forest. It was a route Clay knew well, one he had traveled countless times before. Yet the thought of an accident lingered in both Molly's and his mother's minds, an unspoken fear that suddenly seemed all too real. Clay's mother, determined to find answers, offered to retrace the route. Molly stayed behind with the children, her thoughts racing as she tried to make sense of the situation. Hours passed with no news. Molly paced the house, her anxiety growing with each tick of the clock. Finally, a phone call shattered the silence. Clay's mother had encountered flashing lights and emergency vehicles blocking a section of the highway. The road was cordoned off with police tape, and a thick column of smoke rose from the trees nearby. A sense of dread washed over her as she described the scene. Unable to wait for answers, Clay's mother drove directly to Molly's house and picked her up. Together, they returned to the site. When they arrived, the fire had been extinguished, leaving behind a charred and smoking wreck. Molly's eyes locked onto the burned-out remains of a car at the bottom of the embankment. The shape of the vehicle was unmistakable, its frame a haunting silhouette against the ash-covered ground. Scattered around it were the remnants of paperback books, blackened and barely recognizable. It was all too familiar. Firefighters confirmed the worst. Inside the car, in the driver's seat, was a body burned beyond recognition. Personal belongings found amidst the wreckage matched items Clay always carried, including a small Harley-Davidson pin he cherished. For Molly, the reality was inescapable. The man she had kissed goodnight, the father of her children, was gone. As word spread through Leander, the community rallied around Molly and her children. Neighbors delivered meals, stocked her refrigerator, and offered words of comfort. Donations poured in, a testament to the town's collective grief and support. Molly, though grateful, found little solace in their gestures. The weight of her loss consumed her, leaving her hollow and numb. Yet, as Molly grieved, questions began to surface about the circumstances of Clay's death. Investigators at the scene noted peculiar details that didn't align with a typical car accident. The absence of skid marks suggested the car hadn't braked before leaving the road, and the intensity of the fire was unlike anything they had seen before. The vehicle had been reduced to its frame, and Clay's body was almost entirely incinerated. These anomalies raised suspicions, and the possibility of foul play began to take shape. The autopsy findings only deepened the mystery. Clay's lungs contained no traces of soot, indicating he had not inhaled smoke from the fire. This revelation meant one thing: he was already dead when the flames engulfed the car. Further examination revealed traces of accelerant on the front seat, the unmistakable scent of lighter fluid. What had initially appeared to be a tragic accident was now being re-examined as something far more sinister. Despite the outpouring of sympathy from the community, not everyone mourned Clay's death. Stories began to surface about his temper, his confrontations with others, and the animosity he had cultivated over the years. Some whispered that he had enemies, people who might have wanted him dead. Even at his funeral, the tension was palpable. A close friend's blunt statement that the world might be better off without Clay left many uneasy. Investigators combed through Clay's background, searching for clues. Their attention quickly turned to a recent event that had sent shockwaves through the town. Just days before his death, Clay had pleaded guilty to a heinous crime, an assault that had left a family shattered. The sentence he received was shockingly lenient, a mere 30 days in jail and probation. The father of the victim had publicly expressed his outrage, vowing to make Clay pay. Though this man became a primary suspect, his airtight alibi eliminated him from consideration. The investigation stalled, leaving more questions than answers. For Molly and her children, the cloud of suspicion that surrounded Clay's death only deepened their grief. The truth remained elusive, hidden in the charred remains of a life that had ended far too soon. The questions surrounding Clay Daniels' death loomed large as investigators probed the scene and pieced together fragments of evidence. From the beginning, certain elements of the crash didn't add up. The lack of skid marks on the road suggested the car hadn't swerved or braked before plunging into the forest. This absence of any sign of last-minute control left investigators puzzled. A seasoned driver like Clay, familiar with the treacherous curves of the highway, wouldn't have been caught off guard so easily. The fire presented an even greater mystery. Car fires were not uncommon in accidents, but the blaze that consumed Clay's vehicle had reached an intensity far beyond the norm. The flames had melted the car to its skeletal frame, obliterating almost every trace of the vehicle's interior. Even more troubling was the condition of the body inside. The victim's remains were burned so thoroughly that identification relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, such as personal belongings found at the scene. Among these belongings were several paperback books, blackened and curled by the fire's heat. Scattered near the wreckage, they matched the ones Clay had reportedly intended to deliver to his mother. Alongside these charred remnants, investigators discovered a small Harley-Davidson pin, a cherished item Clay was rarely without. Together, these items seemed to confirm that the remains were his, though doubts lingered. The autopsy findings deepened the enigma. Clay's lungs were free of soot, a revelation that contradicted the assumption that he had been alive when the fire started. Without inhalation of smoke, it was clear he had died before the blaze consumed the car. This crucial detail shifted the focus of the investigation from a tragic accident to a potential act of foul play. The discovery of lighter fluid in the vehicle's interior provided the final piece of evidence that pushed the case into darker territory. The accelerant explained the fire's ferocity and its ability to consume nearly everything in its path. It also suggested intent, pointing to a deliberate act rather than a freak accident. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align, but the picture they formed was far from complete. In the small town of Leander, word of the investigation spread quickly. The community, already shaken by Clay's sudden death, now grappled with the possibility that it wasn't an accident. Rumors circulated, fueled by Clay's reputation and the circumstances of his past. Though Molly's grief seemed genuine, whispers began to surface, casting shadows on her and her family. Clay had been a polarizing figure in the town. While Molly adored him and he was beloved by her children, many others viewed him less favorably. He was known for his volatile temper and a history of conflicts with others in the community. Stories of his confrontations, both verbal and physical, painted a picture of a man who had made as many enemies as friends. The recent revelation of his guilty plea in a criminal case added another layer of complexity. Just 10 days before his death, Clay had admitted to the sexual assault of a 7-year-old girl. His sentence, 30 days in jail and probation, was widely regarded as shockingly lenient. The father of the victim had publicly expressed outrage, vowing to take matters into his own hands if necessary. Though investigators initially considered him a prime suspect, his alibi proved unshakable, leaving them to search elsewhere for answers. As the investigation continued, Molly's behavior began to draw attention. In the days following the accident, she seemed overwhelmed with grief, a devastated widow left to navigate life without her husband. Yet her actions in the weeks that followed painted a different picture. Neighbors noticed her eagerness to move forward, a sharp contrast to the mourning one might expect. The life insurance policy became a focal point. Clay's $110,000 coverage had been left to Molly, and her attempts to expedite the payout raised eyebrows. She reportedly contacted the insurance company repeatedly, urging them to release the funds as quickly as possible. To those around her, it seemed her interest in the money overshadowed her sorrow. Molly's personal life also began to shift. Barely 3 weeks after Clay's death, she started dating again. This development struck many as odd, even unsettling. She introduced a man to her household, presenting him as her new partner. While neighbors whispered about the speed of her moving on, the true impact of these changes was felt within her home. Caleb, her 4-year-old son, who had been deeply bonded with Clay, became withdrawn and volatile. His outbursts and emotional struggles grew more frequent, leaving babysitters and friends concerned. Investigators, too, noted these changes in Molly's life. Her insistence on pushing forward, coupled with the peculiarities surrounding Clay's death, led them to question her more closely. When asked about potential suspects or enemies who might have wanted to harm Clay, Molly's demeanor shifted. What had been sorrow and cooperation now seemed impatient and defensive. Her suggestion that Clay had taken his own life to avoid serving his sentence felt abrupt and dismissive. Though there was no concrete evidence linking Molly to Clay's death, her behavior added to the growing list of unanswered questions. The police remained watchful, determined to uncover the truth behind the fire, the lighter fluid, and the life left in ashes. Molly, whether grieving widow or suspect, found herself at the center of a mystery that refused to be resolved. As the weeks passed, investigators found themselves circling back to Molly Daniels. Her behavior in the aftermath of Clay's death had become a focal point of their inquiry. What had initially appeared to be the grieving actions of a widow now seemed calculated and, at times, unsettling. Despite her outward expressions of sorrow, there was a growing sense among those observing her that something wasn't quite right. Molly's fixation on the life insurance payout raised immediate red flags. She had contacted the insurance company repeatedly, her requests escalating in urgency as the days went by. She left no doubt about her eagerness to claim the $110,000 she was entitled to, seemingly more focused on the money than on mourning the loss of her husband. Neighbors and acquaintances, initially sympathetic to her plight, began to share their discomfort with how openly Molly spoke about the money. For a woman who had just suffered such a profound loss, her enthusiasm for the payout struck many as inappropriate. Beyond the life insurance, Molly's personal life began to shift in ways that further drew attention. Just weeks after Clay's death, she was seen spending time with a new man. Neighbors reported seeing the stranger entering and leaving her home, often interacting with her 2 young children. For those who had supported Molly through her grief, the presence of this man so soon after Clay's death felt jarring. The sight of Molly moving on so quickly contrasted sharply with the image of a devastated widow that she had initially presented. The effects of these changes were most apparent in Caleb, Molly's 4-year-old son. Once a cheerful and easygoing child, Caleb had grown withdrawn and prone to emotional outbursts. Those who spent time with the family noticed his frequent shifts between sadness and anger. At times, he would suddenly look skyward and shout for his father, a heart-wrenching display that left those around him deeply unsettled. The household's new dynamic seemed to confuse and agitate Caleb. He appeared to struggle with the presence of the new man, whom Molly had introduced as her partner. Babysitters described Caleb's volatile emotions and his inability to reconcile the changes happening around him. When one caregiver suggested that Caleb might need professional support to process his grief, Molly dismissed the idea with anger, shutting down the conversation entirely. While these observations painted a troubling picture, they were still not enough to implicate Molly in Clay's death. Investigators lacked tangible evidence linking her to the suspicious circumstances surrounding the crash. However, her demeanor during questioning added to their growing unease. Initially cooperative, Molly had grown impatient and defensive. Her suggestion that Clay might have taken his own life to avoid his upcoming jail sentence felt abrupt and hollow, a deflection that failed to align with the evidence. Determined to find clarity, investigators decided to place Molly under surveillance. A team of undercover officers began monitoring her movements, hoping to uncover any behavior that might shed light on the mystery. For weeks, their efforts seemed futile. Molly's daily routine was predictable, almost monotonous. She woke early, prepared her children for the day, and went to work. After work, she would pick up the kids from the babysitter, return home, and settle into an unremarkable evening. Her life appeared to follow a rigid pattern, one that offered little insight into the questions investigators sought to answer. Occasionally, Molly deviated from her routine to run errands, but these trips were equally mundane. She shopped for groceries, picked up household supplies, and carried out other tasks that seemed entirely ordinary. The officers observed her with growing frustration, their efforts yielding no new leads. If Molly was hiding something, she was doing an exceptional job of keeping it concealed. However, on one particular evening, Molly's behavior took an unexpected turn. After leaving work, she drove to a parking lot near a cluster of local stores. She parked her car and stepped out, but instead of heading into one of the nearby establishments, she approached a dark-colored Mustang parked nearby. A man sat in the driver's seat, and Molly leaned down to speak with him through the window. The man was unfamiliar to the officers, and his presence immediately caught their attention. Molly's body language shifted as she spoke with him. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, her movements cautious and deliberate. After a few moments, she walked around the car and climbed into the passenger seat. The Mustang pulled out of the lot, leaving the undercover officers to follow. The car eventually stopped at a fast food restaurant, where Molly and the man went inside to order food. The two sat at a table by the window, their conversation appearing casual but prompting more questions than answers. For the officers watching, this encounter was unlike anything they had seen in weeks of surveillance. It was the first real break in Molly's otherwise routine life, and it suggested that she might not be as straightforward as she seemed. The man's identity remained a mystery, but his presence introduced a new layer of intrigue. The officers observed the pair closely, noting every detail, from Molly's gestures to the man's demeanor. For the first time in months, the investigation seemed poised to take a significant step forward. As the officers watched from a distance, they prepared to act, knowing that this moment could hold the key to unraveling the truth about Clay Daniels' death. The undercover officers at the fast food restaurant observed Molly and her companion from their vantage point in line. The scene appeared ordinary, two people casually eating and chatting by the window. Yet, the officers' instincts told them otherwise. Something about the man's demeanor struck them as odd. As one officer turned for a closer glance, a sudden jolt of recognition coursed through him. The man sitting with Molly wasn't just anyone. He was someone the officer had seen before. The realization was unsettling. The man looked different, his dark hair and casual posture creating an unfamiliar guise. But the officer couldn't mistake the face. This was Clay Daniels, the very man whose death had launched the investigation months earlier. For a moment, disbelief clouded his thoughts. He had attended the scene of the crash, reviewed the evidence, and stood by as the burned remains were identified as Clay's. Yet here he was, alive and in plain sight, sitting across from the woman who had mourned him. The officer's mind raced, piecing together the implications of what he was witnessing. Clay's survival explained the inconsistencies surrounding the crash. The lack of skid marks, the suspiciously intense fire, and the condition of the body, all pointed to something carefully orchestrated. The realization that the entire tragedy had been staged shifted the investigation into an entirely new dimension. As the officers moved to confront the pair, the truth began to unravel. Clay, presumed dead and buried by the community, had dyed his blonde hair black and assumed a new identity. His decision to reappear, seemingly reckless, now seemed tied to his inability to stay away from Molly and their children. Despite the risks, the couple had reunited, their desperation to be together overriding the need for discretion. Clay's survival had not been achieved without cost. The body found in the burned-out car was revealed to be that of an elderly woman, stolen from a nearby cemetery. The details of this macabre act painted a picture of a man willing to go to horrifying lengths to evade justice. By exhuming the body and placing it in his car, Clay had created a convincing, albeit grotesque, illusion of his death. The fire, set with lighter fluid, was the final touch in the elaborate ruse. It had destroyed nearly all evidence, reducing the car and its occupant to charred remnants that investigators could only identify through personal effects. Clay and Molly had gambled that no one would question the circumstances too closely, relying on the intensity of the blaze to mask any lingering doubts. For weeks after the staged crash, Clay had kept his distance, hiding in the shadows while Molly mourned publicly. Their plan seemed to be working. The insurance company processed the claim, the community rallied around Molly, and investigators found themselves stymied by a lack of leads. Yet, the couple's inability to remain apart ultimately led to their undoing. Clay returned to the home he had supposedly left forever, living openly with Molly and their children. His presence, while disguised, did not escape notice. The strain of maintaining the facade took its toll, particularly on Caleb, the 4-year-old who had adored Clay. The boy recognized his father immediately, despite the dyed hair and new identity. Yet Clay and Molly insisted he was someone else, introducing him as Molly's new boyfriend, Jake. Caleb's confusion and emotional turmoil grew with each passing day, manifesting in outbursts and moments of heartbreaking clarity. He was old enough to sense the lies but too young to comprehend the full scope of his parents' deception. Molly and Clay's boldness culminated in the ill-fated meeting in the parking lot and their subsequent meal at the fast food restaurant. What should have been a private rendezvous was observed by the officers who had been watching Molly for weeks. The decision to meet so openly marked the final mistake in their intricate scheme. When confronted, Clay could offer little in the way of defense. The evidence against him was overwhelming, from the staged crash to the stolen corpse. Molly, too, could not deny her role in the deception. The life insurance claim, the hurried efforts to collect the payout, and her eagerness to move forward with her life all pointed to her complicity. The fallout from their actions was swift and severe. Both Clay and Molly were charged with insurance fraud and other crimes related to the staged death. Their scheme, while initially successful, had collapsed under the weight of their recklessness and inability to remain hidden. The community that had once supported Molly now turned against her, shocked by the depth of her betrayal. For Clay, the consequences were even graver. His attempt to evade justice only resulted in a harsher sentence. In addition to his original charges, he faced punishment for the fraud and the desecration of the elderly woman's grave. His actions had not only deceived investigators but also shattered the trust of those who had once considered him part of their community. As the couple faced the legal repercussions of their actions, the truth behind the staged death revealed a chilling tale of greed, desperation, and the lengths some are willing to go to for personal gain. The carefully constructed illusion they had created was now exposed, leaving nothing but the cold, hard reality of their crimes. The aftermath of Clay and Molly Daniels' scheme unraveled swiftly and mercilessly. Their plan, so audacious in its conception and careless in its execution, left a trail of devastation that rippled through their lives and the lives of those around them. Once the truth emerged, the law's response was uncompromising, ensuring neither of them could escape accountability. Molly Daniels, whose role in the conspiracy had been critical, faced the fallout of her actions first. Her eagerness to collect on Clay's life insurance policy, coupled with her brazen behavior following his supposed death, painted a picture of greed that the court could not ignore. Her lack of remorse further solidified her guilt in the eyes of the investigators and the public. The life she had envisioned with her family, free from financial strain and the shadow of Clay's legal troubles, crumbled under the weight of her own decisions. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a term that reflected not only the financial fraud she had committed, but also her willingness to deceive an entire community. The weight of her betrayal was felt most acutely by those who had supported her in the weeks after Clay's supposed death. Neighbors who had brought meals, donated money, and shared in her grief were left feeling manipulated and betrayed. The sympathy they had once extended to her was replaced by scorn. Clay Daniels, the mastermind behind the staged death, faced an even harsher judgment. Already facing legal consequences for his crimes before the scheme, Clay's attempt to escape justice only deepened the severity of his punishment. His desecration of an elderly woman's grave, a crime that shocked even the most seasoned investigators, highlighted the lengths he was willing to go to for his freedom. The fact that he had exploited another person's remains to perpetuate his lie further underscored his callousness. The court handed Clay a 30-year prison sentence for the insurance fraud and additional charges. On top of this, he received an additional 20 years for violating the terms of his probation, ensuring he would spend the majority of his life behind bars. The once confident man who had boldly re-entered his family's life under the guise of a new identity was now reduced to a figure of public condemnation. The couple's children bore the brunt of the emotional fallout. Caleb, who had struggled with the confusing lies fed to him by his parents, was left without the father figure he had idolized and the stability he desperately needed. His early years, marred by betrayal and upheaval, were a testament to the collateral damage inflicted by Molly and Clay's actions. The 1-year-old, too young to understand the gravity of the situation, would eventually grow up with the weight of her parents' choices casting a long shadow over her life. The community of Leander, once a haven for the Daniels family, was irrevocably changed by the scandal. Molly and Clay's actions fractured the trust that bound the small town together. The neighbors who had once rallied around Molly in her supposed time of need now found themselves grappling with the uncomfortable realization that they had been deceived. Their kindness and generosity had been weaponized in a plot to escape accountability and enrich the couple's lives. Beyond the personal and communal consequences, the case became a cautionary tale for law enforcement and insurance agencies. The brazenness of the Daniels scheme highlighted the need for thorough investigations and cross-referencing of evidence. The lengths to which the couple had gone to fabricate Clay's death, exhuming a body, orchestrating a fire, and creating a narrative of tragedy, revealed vulnerabilities in systems meant to safeguard against fraud. The legal proceedings against Molly and Clay were widely covered, their names becoming synonymous with betrayal and greed. The courtroom was filled with those seeking closure. Neighbors, friends, and even distant onlookers who had followed the story with a mix of fascination and horror. Each revelation, from the stolen body to the discovery of Clay's presence in the home after his supposed death, was met with disbelief and outrage. Molly, after serving a significant portion of her sentence, was eventually granted parole. Her release was met with a muted response, as the scars of her actions lingered in the minds of those she had deceived. She returned to a world that had moved on, her name and actions forever etched in infamy. Clay, however, remained incarcerated, his life defined by the choices that had led to his downfall. For the Daniels family, the dream of freedom and financial stability that had driven their scheme had instead turned into a nightmare of loss, separation, and disgrace. Their once ordinary lives, filled with the familiar rhythms of family and routine, were irreparably altered by their decisions. The fire that had burned so brightly on that fateful night became a symbol of their destruction, consuming not only the illusion they had crafted, but also the trust, love, and stability they had once shared. The aftermath of the Daniels deception lingered long after the court sentences were handed down. The story of Clay and Molly Daniels became a fixture in the collective memory of Leander, Texas, a small town where trust and community were once the cornerstones of daily life. Their scheme, so audacious and cruel, left a stain on the town's identity, a reminder of how far greed and desperation could drive people. For Molly, life after prison was one of isolation and regret. Though she was eventually granted parole, her release into a world that had moved on was far from a second chance. Her name was synonymous with betrayal, and her reputation preceded her wherever she went. The neighbors who had once brought her food and offered her comfort in the days following Clay's staged death wanted nothing to do with her. Their kindness had been exploited, and the wounds of her deception were not easily healed. Molly tried to rebuild her life, but the weight of her actions followed her like a shadow. Employers were hesitant to hire her. Friends avoided her, and even her family ties were strained. The community's collective memory of her manipulation, the lies she told, and the elaborate lengths she went to for financial gain left her with few avenues for redemption. Though she was free from her prison cell, she remained a prisoner of her choices. Clay's fate was sealed behind the cold steel bars of a prison cell. His sentence ensured that he would spend decades paying for his crimes, unable to partake in the life he had fought so desperately to preserve. In the years that followed his incarceration, he faded into obscurity, remembered only as the man who had staged his own death at the expense of others. His name became a cautionary tale, whispered among inmates and referenced in conversations about justice and greed. The Daniels children bore the heaviest burden. Caleb, once a bright and carefree child, carried the emotional scars of his parents' betrayal into adulthood. He struggled to reconcile the father he had loved with the man who had caused so much destruction. The lies about Clay's identity, the confusion of his sudden return, and the ultimate revelation of the truth left Caleb with a fractured sense of trust. His childhood, once filled with playful wrestling matches and shared laughter, had been overshadowed by deception and loss. The younger child, too young to remember the details of those harrowing months, grew up with the knowledge of her parents' actions as a defining part of her identity. As she matured, she pieced together the fragments of her family's story, each revelation adding to the weight she carried. Though she had not been old enough to fully understand the events as they unfolded, the consequences of her parents' choices shaped the trajectory of her life. The community of Leander was left grappling with its own sense of betrayal. In the weeks following Clay's staged death, neighbors had rallied around Molly, embodying the spirit of a small town that cared for its own. They had donated money, stocked her refrigerator, and offered her support during what they believed was a time of unimaginable grief. Discovering that their kindness had been weaponized as part of a fraudulent scheme left many feeling angry and humiliated. The trust that once bound the town together was fractured, replaced by a cautious skepticism that lingered long after the Daniels case faded from headlines. Conversations at grocery stores, churches, and schools often circled back to the events of 2004, each retelling tinged with disbelief and frustration. The story of Molly and Clay became a touchstone for what could happen when greed overshadowed morality. The legal and investigative communities also learned hard lessons from the Daniels case. The ease with which Clay and Molly had manipulated the systems meant to protect against fraud revealed vulnerabilities that required immediate attention. Insurance companies tightened their protocols, implementing stricter checks and balances to ensure such schemes could not be repeated. Law enforcement agencies revisited their investigative practices, using the Daniels case as a cautionary example of how elaborate a lie could become if not scrutinized from every angle. Over time, the events surrounding the Daniels family became a footnote in Leander's history, referenced occasionally in conversations or local lore. New families moved into the neighborhood, unaware of the scandal that had once gripped the community. Yet for those who had lived through it, the memory of Clay and Molly's deception served as a reminder of how deeply trust could be violated. For Caleb and his sibling, life moved forward, albeit with difficulty. They carried the legacy of their parents' actions, navigating a world that often judged them for circumstances beyond their control. The scars of their childhood ran deep, but they sought to build lives free from the shadows of their past. In their own ways, they strived to forge identities separate from the story that had defined their early years. The charred wreckage of Clay's car, the exhumed body, and the dyed hair that had once allowed a man to walk unnoticed through his own town were all remnants of a story rooted in greed and desperation. Though the Daniels scheme failed spectacularly, its impact endured, leaving behind lessons about trust, morality, and the consequences of deception that would not soon be forgotten.